So today we are talking about the basics of DevOps. DevOps is a wild subject, but comparative to the rest of tech and software development, it is relatively new. It's something that wasn't even really a term in the 80s and 90s, and it was something that kind of was built out of necessity. If you think about how developers and operations in companies, tech companies worked, a lot of the times you would just write your code. There was no real standard of verifying and testing whether or not that code worked. And this is something that companies noticed was a huge bottleneck in their productivity. I believe it was a guy in the early 2000s named Martin Fowler who actually came up with the concept of CI, or continuous integration. His concept was that developers should integrate their work frequently, like pretty much daily, just to make sure that everything was working, and those integrations go through tests to make sure that the code is actually up to standard before actually being fully committed in to the main branch. And from this concept, the first early tools were actually invented. Hudson, which you'll now know as Jenkins, actually came out in that early 2000 range to basically give us what we know of as this platform or tool that would allow us to do CI and CD automation. And I want to be clear here, Jenkins was a big deal and an absolute game changer. This was created by Kazuki Kawaguchi at Sun Microsystems. The goal was to automate software building and testing, and so that you could basically replace those manual scripts that most people had to use for those testing environments. And this was extremely useful because the main goal of using it was to be after every code change. So after you were done committing and you were confident about your work, you at least had something that would be able to build and test out your code before actually being able to commit that information over to the main repo. And essentially Hudson became Jenkins once Sun Microsystems got bought out by Oracle, and they had a dispute about the project and everything, and then there was a fork that happened all in about the early 2010s. Ever since, Jenkins has been the main name, and we now use that main fork that Hudson was. One of the biggest reasons that Jenkins is awesome is that it's completely open source. You can download it right now, set up a server, add in your plugins, configure out everything that you want, and be able to get up and running with your continuous integration and continuous deployment. Another cool thing about it was that it had a bunch of plugins because everyone was using it. Most developer teams use this as this was the de facto standard. So because of this, there were numerous plugins that most people had, and it had a huge ecosystem, so that if you needed something done, there was most likely a plugin for it. And in order to write your pipelines, you would actually write it in declarative language, specifically what they call Groovy language, which is a domain specific language. I'm not really about DSL languages, to be honest, but knowing the fact that it's declarative is awesome, and the Groovy language is actually pretty easy once you get your feet into it. It's not that bad, so you can basically read off what you need done, and with the declarative language, it makes it so much easier to make sure that your tests and your build processes work the way you want to under specific circumstances. However, Jenkins was way more complex than what it needed to be. Like a lot of people would be looking for DevOps jobs just to be able to handle Jenkins, because Jenkins in itself was a lot to manage. I mean, even though it's able to do a bunch of CI/CD, it's a lot to manage, especially if you have a lot of projects, a lot of things going on. You're now self-hosting it. Even if you host it somewhere else, you are still managing everything. The actual configuration for setting it up can be a little bit confusing or hard to get into at first. It is Java, so you have to be comfortable with Java in particular. And then on top of that, you have all these plugins, and if a plugin it gets outdated or messes up or something happens, now that can actually mess up your CI/CD process. So you basically needed a full-time DevOps engineer or a DevOps team to be able to handle the plugins, be able to handle the configuration, be able to handle if something bad happens. And so it was something where, although Jenkins was a lot more efficient than just using the waterfall or agile methodology with no tools, it still could be improved, and in my opinion was a lot of waste in tech debt just to be able to have your code being able to build and run properly when there can be better ways to do this. And nowadays, at least for most things that I see for most projects that are not government issued or something where it has to be completely off of the internet, Now there are way better ways and tools to be able to do CI/CD. One of my favorite is using GitHub Actions or Bitbucket pipelines. Now, instead of you having to deal with CI/CD on a separate server where you now have to manage this, whether it's local or you had it in AWS or Azure, now there are runners or actions or pipelines that could be actually integrated with your actual code repository if you're using GitHub or Bitbucket. And what's cool about it is that you don't actually even need to save your code directly on that repo. You could actually use their runners or their actions locally and be able to do the same thing that Jenkins was able to do as well, with having the benefit of managing this all in a web interface like Bitbucket or GitHub Actions. It's a lot easier to set up because you don't need to set up anything or configure anything in order for Bitbucket pipelines or GitHub Actions to work. It will just work out of the box as long as you define out your YAML file, just like with Jenkins, where you are declaring what's going to happen in a Groovy language or in a Jenkins file. With Bitbucket pipelines or GitHub Actions, you're going to declare what you want to happen inside of a YAML file. For GitHub Actions, it's going to be a GitHub Actions YAML file, something like that. And for Bitbucket, it's going to be a Bitbucket pipelines YAML file. And both of these declarative formats, although in YAML, do slightly differ because obviously they are for different platforms, but for the most part, they are the exact same with how you approach it. You define out what you want to happen. If you want something to be triggered based on an event like a pull request or a specific branch, you can make it so that it does testing. You can make it so that it will actually deploy out to a cloud server like AWS, Azure, Fly.io, whatever you want. It can run a bunch of commands that you want in order. You can actually do linting. You can do a bunch of different things that you want with this, but you don't need to configure up anything locally for this at all. And that's what makes this a lot more easier to get into. Just to start with, you can make a project right now in GitHub and make a GitHub Actions YAML file in the .github folder, specify what you want to do. Let's say you want to just make a hello world console log. You can do that, and when you're done with this and you push your code up to GitHub, it will show in the actions list what's actually going on and the logs and everything, right? And you don't have to really configure out anything to make that work. Another cool thing is that now you don't have to deal with multiple plugins failing because maybe one updated and now has crashed out something else. Now you don't have to deal with that at all. Bitbucket and GitHub do have actual plugins that you can use, something like in the marketplace where you can add those in, but those usually won't cause issues comparatively to something like Jenkins plugins, where you have to make sure that each dependency kind of works with one another. And if we just take a step back, one of the cool things about CI/CD, whether or not you're using Bitbucket pipelines or GitHub Actions, is the fact that you can do things that have nothing to do with CI/CD at all. All this is an ability to be able to run a instance in the cloud or self-hosted that is able to do a set of instructions of actions that you want it to do. So for example, I remember reaching out with Stack Overflow a couple years ago, trying to figure out how I can make a GitHub action update a README file on GitHub, right? Like you can make a project template. You can then pull in that template, and let's say you want to update that template and then make your own repo from this, right? I want it so that when you change the README of that information, or let's say you change the title of whatever your project is, it would naturally update the README as well, right? So instead of having a boilerplate for the README, you can have actual words and things that are based off of your repo's name. You can do web scraping from it. I've seen numerous things where there are GitHub action runners that will do web scraping and collect data that is from different websites. You can do that. You can use Selenium on it. You can essentially do anything that you want, because all it is doing is basically taking a actual Linux instance and being able to do the commands that you wanted. Another cool thing is that you can specify the Linux instance that's there, and you can set it up with everything that you need. That's kind of cool. It's almost like a Docker. You can essentially set it up with a specific type of OS that GitHub Actions or Bitbucket will basically allow. Most of the time, at least with Bitbucket, and I think with GitHub Actions, you could use the list of Docker OSs that you can use and pull in for that image and use that for its starting point. So therefore you can use that, pull that in, and then from there work on whatever you need. Or you can then, let's say if you needed to build out or compile out something like Python or .NET or whatever, you can actually still do that in your Bitbucket pipeline, so you can download everything you need for your testing properly. So that's what makes CI/CD awesome, right? You could be able to write your code, you then can update your code, and when you push your code, it's able to do all the testing and all the things that you would naturally normally do manually to ensure that it's actually going to work with your project, all in the cloud or all self-hosted somewhere, that you can be able to then look at the logs and ensure everything's working. And then from there, you can ensure with confidence that your actual code will actually be deployed to wherever you want it to be. So that's all I wanted to talk about when it came to this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you guys liked the video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comments below. And if you like the video, please leave a thumbs up. And I hope that you'll subscribe so that you can check out more of my videos that I leave every single week. Other than that, I hope the rest of your day goes well. Peace, everyone.